Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Hordes Dairyman webinar. My name is Sam Rasmussen, Digital Marketing Manager at Hordes Dairyman, and I'll serve as today's host for this webinar, which will be all about disease impact and best disease prevention practices for dairy calves. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF of the slides that can be printed. The handout can be found in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. If you have questions for our speaker, you can type them into the questions section of the control panel. With that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Geoff Smith is a senior technical services veterinarian with Zoetis, bringing decades of expertise in ruminant health and calf management. He earned his bachelor's degree in animal and dairy science from Clemson University and went on to complete his DVM, master's, and PhD at the University of Illinois. Before joining Zoetis, Dr. Smith spent 20 years as a professor of ruminant medicine at North Carolina State University, where he specialized in calf health and nutrition. A diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine, or Large Animal Internal Medicine, Dr. Smith's clinical and research interests center on improving the health, welfare, and performance of young calves. All right, well, thanks for being with us, Dr. Smith. Please take it away.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks for everybody that's joining us this afternoon. At least it's afternoon in most of the country. So my goal over the next 50 minutes or so is to talk briefly about the economics of the heifer calf to the farm and how that's changed over the past 20, 25 years, particularly over the last 5 years, and the impact diseases can have on both calf health and future productivity. And we'll highlight kind of some key aspects of disease prevention in calves, and then we'll end this webinar with a brief discussion of kind of key treatment principles. So just in my short time as a veterinarian, I got out of veterinary school in the 90s, and really back then, most dairymen viewed calves as an expense. Okay, they said, I want to raise them as cheaply as possible. They're not going to pay for themselves until somewhere in the middle of their second lactation. There was no sense of emphasis to place money or time really into raising quality calves. They thought, if I run short on heifers, I can always buy more. They're pretty cheap. If I send them to a heifer raiser and get most of them back, that'll work. If I get behind, they're small, they'll catch up later once they enter the milking string. So I feel like I've spent most of my veterinary career trying to convince people to stop thinking of them as an expense and really view them as an investment in the future of the dairy. And that's kind of where most farms have gotten now, where they realize these calves really are an investment. We're spending a lot of time producing beef on dairy cross calves that are producing extra revenue for the farm. So generally the heifers we're having, we've already decided that these are the future of our dairy. These are the heifers that I want to produce milk on my dairy 2 years from now. And over the last 10 to 15 years, there's a lot of new research that says how we treat that heifer, sometimes even in the first 6 to 8 weeks of life, has a pretty profound impact on her ability to produce milk once she makes it into the lactating herd. Things like early growth. We'll talk about average daily gain in the first 8 weeks of life and how that's correlated to future milk productivity. Also disease. We know that, for example, respiratory disease, those calves that we treat for pneumonia, they will have less milk production once they enter the lactating herd. So what I've tried to get people to think about and transition to is producing quality calf, not just having calves alive that we can breed once they hit 13, 14 months of age, okay? We know that heifer survival rate is one of the key things that affects profitability of dairies. We really need to focus not just on survival, but having calves free of disease that are growing well, they're reaching adequate body weights, not only at weaning, but at calving, that we're producing quality animals that everybody can be proud of. So what are current trends in the industry? Obviously, beef on dairy has been around for a while. They continue to bring high prices and probably will, at least for the foreseeable future, okay? Obviously, we're very short on beef nationwide. The Mexican border is closed because of the possibility of screwworm introduction. So the beef industry really wants these calves. Because of that, many farms are taking advantage of beef semen. They're extensively utilizing beef semen. And that has been a good thing in terms of extra revenue for dairies. In some cases, though, breeding decisions based heavily on using beef semen have restructured the heifer pipeline in farms. We used to, years ago, we had farms that probably had too many heifers. I don't go to many dairies that have too many heifers now. There are a few that do sell extra heifers, but the number of farms that have a surplus of heifers has really dwindled. What we know is purchasing dairy replacements has become more difficult and much more expensive. The number of dairy replacement heifers out there is way down. You know, 10 years ago, you could buy a springing heifer for less than $1,000. Even 3 years ago, numbers that coming out of auctions were $1,800, $1,900. You know, today, for people that are looking, I hear numbers as high as $3,500 to $4,000. So, you know, the being able to purchase heifers when you need them, or just selling all your calves and buying them when you need them, those models aren't really working very well anymore. So because we're producing so many beef animals, I have dairies that this has really restricted the ability to make appropriate culling decisions. They can't cull animals that need culled, maybe high somatic cell count cows, because they don't have enough heifers to really come in and take their spot. So while we want to take advantage of these beef on dairy calves and the revenue from these calves, we can't short our numbers, and we need to make sure we have enough heifers. And really, you know, realize if you need 50 heifers to calve in every month, I'm probably going to need to produce 70 or 65. But have some conversations with your veterinarian about that and try to figure out what are your heifer needs. So calf health continues to be a big problem on some farms. We still have pretty high mortality rates. We'll talk about what those are. We still have significant rates of both diarrhea and respiratory disease in the industry. We know that respiratory disease is associated with future productivity. So studies have shown anywhere from a 500 to 1,200 pound decrease in first lactation milk associated with pneumonia. We also know that scours not only is the leading cause of calf death, but it becomes a significant risk factor for the development of pneumonia. A lot of these scouring calves, they may scour for 5 or 6 days. They're really skinny at the end. Their immune system is not working really well because they're in a negative energy balance. Sure enough, a week later, those calves get pneumonia. So we still need to focus on not only producing enough heifers, but making sure that we prevent disease and that they're weaning properly grown, healthy calves with good lungs. So this data is from USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, NAM studies. So that stands for National Animal Health Monitoring Survey. We haven't done a NAMS dairy study since 2014, but if you look back really over the last 35 to 40 years and look at what we call pre-weaning calf mortality, that is mortality from calves that are still alive at 48 hours. Generally, if they're born dead or they die in the first day, they consider that a stillbirth in these studies. But we've been as high as 10, 11%. And last time we did this study, we're still at 6.5%. So we're still losing a fair number of calves in the first 2 months of life. You know, and we really haven't had new major diseases. The major cause of death are still scours and respiratory disease, which really hasn't changed in a long time. And that data would be pretty much the same around the world. Our two major diseases that we struggle with, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Asia, are diarrhea and pneumonia. Okay, so we don't really have new diseases, but we still struggle to prevent and manage the diseases that we've had for a long time. So I want to show you just a few slides from studies over the last 5 to 8 years on the consequences economically to having respiratory disease in calves. We know that if you have respiratory disease as a calf, you are less likely to make it into the lactating herd, okay? We also know that if you do make it into the lactating herd, your milk production won't be the same as your herd mates that were raised under the same condition, but they didn't develop pneumonia. We know that calves with respiratory disease have reduced growth rates, at weaning time, at breeding time, they will weigh less than their herd mates that didn't get respiratory disease. And there is even some data that maybe is connected to the poor growth, but those calves that had respiratory disease also had a reduction in the conception rate, so even potentially affecting fertility and reproduction. This is a study that was done in Wisconsin by University of Wisconsin. So this study followed heifers through their first lactation. They divided them into those calves that have been treated for respiratory disease in the first 60 days of life, as compared to the herd mates from farms that had not been treated with respiratory disease in the first 60 days of life. What they found was, if you didn't have pneumonia, about 85% of those calves made it into the lactating herd. If you did have respiratory disease, only about 65%. So again, about a 20% decrease if you had respiratory disease in your likelihood of being able to eventually enter the lactating herd, become an adult lactating cow. This is another study that was done on a dairy near Provo, Utah. So this was a large dairy, and they followed the records for a 6-year period. So they looked at over 14,000 calvings, and they basically split heifers into those that have been treated for respiratory disease in the first 4 months or 120 days of life versus those calves that had no history of being treated in the first 4 months for respiratory disease. So what they found is, if you had respiratory disease, you had over a 500-pound decrease in milk production. We also saw, as we talked about in the last study, you had a lower chance of actually making it into the lactating herd. Okay, so 35% of those heifers that were classified as treated for pneumonia actually departed the herd or were culled before calving, versus only 17%. So kind of like we saw in the last study, about 20% less chance of making it into the lactating herd. This was another study done at Cornell that showed us some data on the reduction in conception rate. So this study used ultrasound. So this not only looked at whether they had been treated for respiratory disease or not, but was kind of assessing the severity of respiratory disease. So they're looking at lung consolidation, or essentially how big of an abnormal area that they saw in the lung. So in this study, 80% of the heifers were classified as normal, 20% had abnormal lungs or consolidated lungs. They didn't actually see any difference in death loss in those animals post-weaning, but in the heifers with consolidated lungs, they did see a decrease in conception rate. So 62% in the animals without pneumonia versus only 50% in the animals with respiratory disease. Again, we see this increased risk of cattle being culled before they enter the lactating herd associated with the presence of lung consolidation. The last study I'll mention here, this was from Canada, University of Guelph study. They actually went out and ultrasounded calves from 3 different dairies, and they reported them as having lung consolidation or not. And again, if you had consolidated lung, if you had abnormal lung, they saw almost a 1,200-pound reduction in milk yield during the first lactation as compared to normal calves. So, you know, repeatedly in a number of studies, we've seen the consequence of having respiratory disease as a calf. You're less likely to make it into the lactating herd. Your growth rates aren't going to be as high. Maybe your conception rates aren't as good. And certainly study after study have shown these calves don't produce as much milk as their herd mates that don't have respiratory disease. So this was kind of summarized in a recent meta-analysis. This was a study where they kind of went through all this data that's been produced in the last 10 to 15 years and said, what do we know about the impact of calfhood respiratory disease on future performance? And this kind of summarizes what we've talked about already. They see an increase in mortality. They see this, again, this increased risk of removal from the herd before calving. Typically at weaning, these calves that have respiratory disease are about 8 to 10 pounds less than the calves that didn't have respiratory disease, so a decrease in growth weight. And pretty consistently across these studies, we've seen less milk during the first lactation. Nobody's really done a lifetime study, you know, what is the impact of respiratory disease on milk production over 3 to 4 lactations. Most of these studies have been based on just the first lactation, but certainly there's an impact on lifetime milk production in these calves that develop pneumonia. So there's an economic study that was done by Dr. Mike Overton a number of years ago. This was published in 2020, where he tried to put a cost estimate on a case of respiratory disease. What is this costing the farm? So things that he took into account in his model, we've already said these heifers with respiratory disease, they have lower growth rates. There's an increased risk of mortality. Obviously, there's some type of cost associated with treating these animals with antibiotics or whatever we're going to do to help them get through respiratory disease. There's an increased risk of culling. They're less likely to make it into the lactating herd. And then if they do, there's reduced milk production. So when he did an economic model that is published, and again, this is about 5 years ago now, what he found is the cost of respiratory disease in the first 120 days of life was about $300. And it sort of depends on whether you identified those heifers and were able to remove them from the herd, or whether that heifer that's going to be less productive was allowed to enter into the lactating herd anyway. If you think about it, prices have changed a lot since then. Dr. Overton actually recently updated this model with current numbers, and that number of what does a case of respiratory disease cost the producer, it's closer to $400 now. So every time we're treating one of these calves with pneumonia, that's $400 worth of impact. Doesn't mean we don't want to identify pneumonia and treat it, but if we're treating 60% of our calves for pneumonia or 70%, we need to put some thought into prevention. What could we be doing better to try to lower? Because even though they may be responding to treatment, there is potentially cost to the farm of all those animals developing respiratory disease. What is the cost of diarrhea? It's not really well understood. I have never seen a publication that puts a dollar value on a case of diarrhea. We do know it's the leading cause of mortality or death loss in calves. There's data that says it has a pretty significant impact on weight gain or weaning weight. There was a study published recently from Canada that said calves with scours had a weaning weight decrease of 33 pounds as compared to their herd mates that didn't have scours. Certainly there's cost of treatment, whether that's IV fluids or oral electrolytes. There's really no link at this point between diarrhea and long-term production like we have with respiratory disease. The one thing I would say, though, is it's becoming clear in several large studies that one of the big risk factors for respiratory disease in young calves is diarrhea. Several studies have shown that these calves that go through scours, particularly if they go through 5, 6, 7 days of scours, those are the ones that wind up getting respiratory disease in that 3 to 8 week period. Okay, so certainly there is some cost of diarrhea to the dairy. I just can't really give you a number like we can for respiratory disease. So I want to spend some time talking about prevention and realize I'm probably going to go through a lot of these things pretty quickly. Things like colostrum obviously could be a webinar by themselves, but I kind of want to hit each of these at a very high level, and I want everybody to go back and kind of look at these aspects on their own dairy and think, am I doing a good job, or is there room for improvement here? Certainly, I think for disease prevention, day one calf care is huge. And by day one calf care, really what I'm referring to is the cleanliness of the maternity environment and then colostrum management, how good of a job we're doing in those two areas. I really think this needs to be a focus on dairy farms. I think it's kind of where calves get their start. If they're born in a dirty maternity environment, really no matter what we're doing from the rest of the way, we're still going to struggle a little bit. As a general rule of thumb, if you're having trouble with calves less than a week of age, you really need to look at the cleanliness of your maternity environment, the cleanliness of your colostrum. That's probably where that early disease is coming from. So making sure we have a well-trained maternity crew, making sure we have a clean environment for those calves to be born really needs to be a focus on a dairy, okay? making sure that we're identifying those calves, getting them moved out of the maternity environment as quickly as possible, dipping the navel right away, harvesting colostrum are all really important things. So one of the things I will do is spend some time doing maternity pen audits where we go through and actually look at how they collect colostrum. Is that equipment clean? Okay. What about feeding equipment, esophageal feeders, bottles, nipples? Is that clean? One of the things we can use is the picture you see on the right. It's called an ATP meter. Some people will call this a luminometer. But basically what this does is detect ATP. Everybody remembers ATP from high school biology. It's kind of an energy molecule that's found in all living cells. When we swab different surfaces, so it may be the inside of esophageal feeder, it may be the bucket that they're using to harvest colostrum in, I can get some general idea of how dirty that is, how much organic matter is present. So we'll go through and do these things for dairies and kind of tell them how you're doing overall, but you don't have to have an ATP meter to really go through and say, hey, that dip cup on the left is really dirty. You know, every time you as a manager, you as the owner of a dairy veterinarian walk through the maternity area, even without an ATP meter in my hand, I can really assess whether things look pretty clean or whether things don't look clean. Okay, I can look at the wheelbarrow on the left that we're using to haul calves out and say that that has not been cleaned in a long time. I need to do something different there. These are, picture on the right is calf holding facilities where calves go for the first 24 to 48 hours and they get moved to hutches. It doesn't take an ATP meter to say that's pretty nasty. You know, that really is going to increase the risk of disease. I need to do something about getting that clean. So I would encourage you, look at, I deal with a lot of dairies that, they put time and money into expanding maybe the parlor, adding new barns, but we still have very small maternity footprints compared to the size of the dairy. It really hasn't mattered from a research perspective, whether you have individual calving stalls or group calving stalls. What really matters is the cleanliness of that environment. I really prefer that on large dairies, instead of having a big pack or a big area, we have a separate area for calving. So go ahead and move that cow in to that environment right as you see feet or the amniotic sac. And really what that does is two things. That limits the amount of time the calf and the cow are spending in there. But by having a smaller area, I can usually get the producer to change the bedding much more frequently. I would love to see the bedding change multiple times a week, maybe even daily in some situations where you have a lot of cows passing through. So making sure that we have a maternity pen that's big enough for the farm, but also one that we can keep pretty clean is really, really important for raising healthy calves. So here's a video. A lot of people will ask me, what is the best type of maternity pen? This is just one I like. This is a farm down south. So you can see this is clean. It's got panels, but I can use these panels if I have a heifer that wants some privacy. I can kind of pin her off, but yet I can swing these back and get a tractor in there twice a week to really change all this bedding pretty efficiently. So this doesn't mean this is what your maternity pen should look like. This is just an example on a large dairy of a maternity pen environment that I've seen be very, very successful. Even though it's large, we're able to get a bucket loader in there and get this cleaned out multiple times a week and get the bedding changed. Okay. Colostrum management. This is still part of day one calf care. And I would say this is probably the most important, single most important aspect of raising calves. If you're not happy with your calves, if you think you have too much death loss, this is probably where I would encourage you to ask the veterinarian to start. If you're not doing a good job here, this is going to have consequences throughout the rest of your calf raising system, so to speak. So again, we could spend a lot of time on colostrum, and I just want to sort of highlight this. But the best practice for colostrum management, number one, we want to make sure we get colostrum harvested from the cow as soon as possible. Realize that the antibody concentration in colostrum starts dropping as soon as the cow calves. I would really like the colostrum get harvested within an hour or two. In some farms that may not be possible. We still have smaller farms where people go to bed at night. There's not an overnight maternity shift. To me, that cow that had a calf overnight becomes the first priority the next morning. I need to get her milked and I need to get that calf fed. You know, if we're waiting 12 hours, 14 hours for that cow that just calved to go through the parlor before we can get her colostrum harvested, you're probably always going to have some degree of problem with passive transfer. Secondly, we need to make sure that we get those calves fed as soon as possible. Realize that the efficiency of the calf's gut to absorb IgG or antibody drops about 4% per hour after birth. So, you know, we've all heard we've got 24 hours to get colostrum in, but realize even 8 to 12 hours after the calf is born, it's not absorbing that antibody near as efficiently as it was when that calf was born. So we need to have a plan in place for getting it out of the cow and into the calf as quickly as we can. And then lastly, we need to make sure the colostrum is clean. We know that contaminated colostrum, whether it's dirty equipment, whether we're having a storage problem, we're not getting it cooled down quickly, maybe it's sitting out too long, those bacteria will actually compete in the gut with antibodies for absorption. Not only can those bacteria make the calf sick, but they can lead to failure of passive transfer. So typically we're feeding 3 to 4 liters of colostrum to these calves, ideally within 2 hours of birth. If that's not possible in your dairy, I would say just as quickly as possible. I would encourage you, whether you're doing this yourself, whether you have veterinarians pulling blood, monitor some total proteins on occasion. Even if it's once a month, we're going to bleed 10 calves. I think total protein and colostrum management, this is important enough that I would want to know on a pretty regular basis, how am I doing here? Okay. Unfortunately, the last time they did a NOM study, the percent of dairies that were actually routinely looking at their total proteins was less than 5%. So not many people do this, but I think this is really important. So if you are monitoring total proteins, realize that kind of the goals for what these data or what these numbers are supposed to be have changed in the last 3 to 4 years. When I was in vet school, I was taught that if calves were above 5.5 on total protein, that was pretty good. Now there's a lot of new data saying if we can get these values even higher, above 6 to 6.2, you'll see even further reduction in diarrhea, respiratory disease, and ultimately death loss. So typically what we do here is somewhere between 18 to 24 hours after the calf got colostrum, all the way out to 7 or 8 days, we can pull a blood sample, we can check the total protein, and that will give us some indication of how good of a job we're doing on the farm with colostrum management and passive transfer. And then the last thing about colostrum, one of the kind of the exciting new areas out there is post day 1 colostrum use. You know, what this means is we're feeding 2nd, 3rd, 4th, maybe even 5th milking colostrum, or potentially a colostrum replacer powder to these calves. Obviously, if this calf was still nursing the dam, it wouldn't get 1 meal of colostrum and then switch to milk. It would get, you know, probably 3 days of milk that has some antibodies in it. So there is new research that's looked at feeding colostrum beyond just 1 feeding or even the first day of life. And most of that data has been really positive. Some of those studies have looked at using colostrum as a treatment for scours or disease. Some of that has looked at post day 1 use of colostrum as a preventative, and all of that has been pretty positive. You know, how do we accomplish that on dairies? I think it's difficult. You know, basically what that would mean is I'm milking all the way through probably her 5th or 6th milking and keeping that milk separate from the regular milk. But that also probably means I'm mixing up different milk for calves that are 10 days to 2 weeks and younger as I am for older calves. But just think about this, you know, is there any way that I could make this work? I think we don't really know yet how much IgG they need. Some of the research would suggest as little as 20 to 30 grams per day per calf can be helpful. Certainly, if you're a farm that's selling a lot of colostrum and your calf health is suffering, you might be better off, using and feeding some of that colostrum instead of selling it. I think the key is going to be feeding this continually for the first week or 2 weeks of life. If you're buying colostrum replacer powder, it's not inexpensive, but there is some benefit to doing this. So I want to mention post day one colostrum use. There's a lot of new research on it. It's pretty exciting. From a getting it done standpoint on a dairy, it's not easy, but just something to think about. Maybe we'll have, ad packs in the future that can go in milk and kind of produce transition colostrum or transition milk easier. Maybe this will get more cost effective, but just something to think about. So the next thing I want to talk about, this is kind of the thing I think we've done wrong for a long time in the dairy industry, is nutrition. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, viewing the calf as an expense instead of an investment. Typically, milk is the most expensive feed the animal will ever eat. So the classic paradigm is we're going to feed them just enough milk to keep them alive, and we'll feed them more later and they'll catch up. So kind of the 2 quarts twice a day or a pound of powder has been the gold standard. But there is a lot of new data over the last 10 to 15 years showing we should be feeding calves a lot more milk than we do. I want to share just a couple of studies, and I'm not going to dwell on these a long time, but just to kind of illustrate this. This is a study that was done in Cornell. This is with cryptosporidial challenge. So in this study, they've got 2 groups of calves. They've got calves on what they call a conventional plane of nutrition, which is 2 quarts of milk replacer twice a day. And that was a 20% protein, 20% fat milk replacer. And then they've got another group that they call high plane of nutrition calves. They're getting an increased volume, and they're also getting a better quality milk replacer. They're getting a 28% protein milk replacer. So in this study, they infected calves with cryptosporidium, which is a protozoal pathogen, very common cause of calf diarrhea. And then they monitored these calves to see what would happen. So both groups got scours. I'm not going to tell you that feeding them more milk prevented diarrhea, but what happened was the calves that were on a higher plane of nutrition, they actually maintained their hydration much better. They had a faster resolution of diarrhea. Diarrhea was gone in 2 to 3 days. They grew. They continued to gain weight while they had scours, where the other calves actually lost weight. They had a better feed efficiency. So feeding these calves at a higher plane of energy actually helped them get through scours. This is a very similar study, except this was done in Texas. This was done with a salmonella challenge instead of a cryptosporidial challenge, and these were Jersey calves instead of Holstein calves, okay? So here we have low plane of nutrition, 2 quarts of milk twice a day, versus high plane of nutrition, higher volume of milk, better quality milk replacer. The only difference in this study is not only did they look at what happened to the calves, but they actually tried to characterize the immune response to the salmonella challenge. So just like we saw in the crypto study, the calves that were on higher planes of nutrition were more resistant to the disease challenge, but they also had a much more robust immune response, okay? So realize that it takes energy to run your immune system. If you're a calf that's starving, you're not going to be able to adequately respond to disease challenge. The last study I'll share with you, this was from Bavaria, southern Germany. So these would mostly be Simmental, dairy Simmental herds. So this study was done by basically the USDA equivalent over there. This was the Bavarian Animal Health Service. These were veterinarians. What they did was they identified herds through records that had a lot of diarrhea in calves. And then they identified some control herds that didn't have a lot of scours. They sent these veterinarians out to the herds to do big risk assessments to try to see what's the difference in terms of management practices between these farms that are having a lot of calf diarrhea problems and the other herds that are not. So what were some of the things that were significant in their study? So calving pen cleaned after every calving. That was one of the things that decreased the risk of diarrhea. That makes sense. We've talked about maternity environment, the cleanliness of that impacting the risk of disease. If the newborn calf was left with the dam longer than 3 hours, that increased the risk of disease. We've talked about that as well. Okay, colostrum management was also important. But the most significant thing in their study that actually decreased the risk of disease was feeding calves as much milk as they wanted during the first week of life. Okay, so there's a lot of data now that says if we maintain these calves on higher planes of nutrition, we can reduce disease. I talk to a lot of people that, they say, okay, we'll feed calves a little bit more, but let's wait till they get through scours. And what I would encourage you to do is feed calves more early. By 4 to 5 days, they should be on 3 quarts of milk twice a day at least. Let's get them into good body condition so they can handle diarrhea, not increase milk after diarrhea. Now, some people will say, well, if I feed them more, they get diarrhea. Realize that milk is not incredibly formed when it comes out the other end. It's pretty loose. Most of you have changed a diaper. You'll appreciate that. Realize that if I go from feeding 4 quarts to 6 quarts or 4 quarts to 8 quarts a day, there's going to be more manure that comes out the other end. These calves may seem to be scouring, but if they're happy, up, active, and drinking their milk, I really wouldn't worry about that. Milk and future production. Obviously, it's going to cost more money to feed calves more milk, and some producers will say, well, how am I going to pay for that? One of the ways we're going to pay for that is there's going to be less disease, which we've just talked about. Another way we're going to pay for that is these calves will actually produce more milk once they enter the lactating herd if they've been fed more. There's a lot of data now, and I don't want to go through individual studies. I'll just sort of summarize it with this slide. Many studies here. So this is not based on 1 study or 2 studies. You look at the number of studies here. These are all studies where they look at calves that have been through conventional nutrition. So probably 4 quarts of milk twice a day, or 4 quarts of milk split into 2 feedings versus some aspect of a higher plane of nutrition. Some people use the term accelerated growth diet. And here you can see in the highlighted column, it's kilograms on the left and pounds on the right. Some of these studies are 1,000 pounds more milk. Some of these studies are 2,000 pounds more milk. A couple of these studies are even 3,000 pounds more milk just in the first lactation, associated with increased average daily gain, increased weaning weights, increased plane of nutrition. So if we feed these calves better, they will produce better once they enter the lactating herd. So just to summarize this, for every quarter-pound increase in average daily gain I can get in the first 8 weeks of life, if I can go from 1.25 to 1.5, you're going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 pounds more milk just in the first lactation. If I can go from 1.25 to 1.75, I might get 800 pounds more milk just in the first lactation. So what should goal be? Minimum goal, we say, is the double birth weight. Some people are saying maybe that's not even enough. We need to do better than that. I would like to see you weighing some of your calves. Again, I know it's not always fun to weigh an 8 or 9 week old calf, but that's probably the best way to assess your nutrition program. If you have birth weight and a weaning weight, we can look at what is your average daily gain from birth to weaning. Probably good would be somewhere in the 1.5 to 1.6 range. Very good would be 1.7, 1.8. And, if you're feeding that calf on an auto feeder or mob feeder and they can drink really close to as much as they want, they'll be in the 2.0 to 2.3 pounds per day. But if you have calves that are 1.4, 1.3, probably that is associated with disease that you're seeing in your herd. I'm not saying poor nutrition is causing it, but there's certainly opportunities if you're at that level of average daily gain, I think, to really reduce disease, increase productivity by increasing the amount of milk and increasing the average daily gain there. So weighing calves, again, I've had producers tell me, anybody that tells me I should weigh calves has clearly never done it. I get that it's not fun. Kind of like total proteins, I'm not saying we need to do it on every calf. I do think we should do it at least quarterly, seasonally, to see what my individual average daily gains is. Some people will send me trailer weights. This is what these 40 calves weighed. That really isn't that helpful to me. As a veterinarian, what I would like to know is what is the impact of disease on weight gain. I just can't get that from a trailer weight. I want individual weights, birth weights, weaning weights, at least occasionally, to really enable me as a consultant, as a veterinarian, somebody working with your herd, to be able to assess your nutrition program. And then post-weaning nutrition, obviously this could be a seminar on itself, but if we're going to spend time and money getting these calves started right, we need to make sure they continue on that positive point of energy after weaning. The goal is to calve these heifers at 85% of mature body weight. So if the mature body weight is 1,600 pounds, we need to make sure that when they calve without the calf, they're at that 1,250 to 1,300 pounds. And a lot of farms are not growing their heifers appropriately. Small heifers aren't going to be as productive. So randomly transitioning these calves to a cheaper ration post-weaning, that's going to create stress, that's going to increase disease, and that's going to make sure that they never really achieve their proper productivity level. So there's a lot of benefit at making sure we start them off properly and then maintain them that way. With that, let me stop here, pause here for a minute, and see if we have any questions to this point.
Hey, Dr. Smith. Yeah, we actually did have some questions come in. I'll pull those up real quick. And thank you, everyone, for your participation. It's been great so far. All right, so question number one is, how effective are the oral antibodies versus scours in calves?
So we're actually going to talk about that. My opinion is not really. I'm getting ready to get into a few slides on kind of vaccination to reduce scours. So we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail.
Okay. Our next question here says, when thinking about the cost of calves, both heifers and dairy beef, now being well over $1,000 for 2-day-old calves, a lot of them being moved to calf ranches for raising, how important is the preventative nutrition concept of functional ingredients in milk replacers compared to the current treatment options for select calf problems and the added labor costs for treatment related to scours or respiratory and ultimately impacting mortality?
So good question. I was, when we say the functional products, maybe the question is getting at, there's certainly a lot of new technologies that we can put in milk and milk replacers, whether those are yeast extracts or antibodies or different products. I think anything that can really reduce disease is going to be good. Certainly we need to look at what's the economic impact. A nutritionist, I'm a veterinarian. What I would encourage you to look at is there published data out there? What is the impact on, using a product and the number of calves that get disease? What is the impact on growth rate? Everything we put in milk or put in these calves is going to add cost. And certainly the cost has got to pay for itself. If I'm adding $1 a day by putting something in my milk, would I be better off just to feed more milk? So I do think there's some new technologies that are going to be really good. I don't want to go through and comment on each of them because, some of them I may not be an expert in, but I would encourage you to look at some of those, but make sure you look at the science, ask for data. If you work with different sales reps, can they give you some data, and just look at the economics of, does this really make sense for my herd?
All right, thanks, Dr. Smith. We have another one. Any suggestions for addressing variability in colostrum quality to ensure best passive transfer?
So there's always going to be some variation. There quite a bit. Sometimes I was at a dairy a few weeks ago, and I was doing the maternity pen audit, and their form that they were recording their Brix values on, it kind of said 23, 24. There wasn't much variation, which made me a little bit skeptical. And I asked where the Brix refractometer was, and there actually was no batteries in it. Nobody remembers when there were batteries in it the last time. So, we always look and see what the records say, but, make sure you investigate more deeply sometimes. So I think testing colostrum is really critical. It's really easy to use a Brix refractometer. What I would say is some variation is normal. If you have a lot of variation, I would look back at, are there long delays on some of these cows before I'm getting them get milked? Sometimes the cows that calve 2 hours before we milk them are the ones that have Brix values at 28 and 30. The ones that calved a long time ago are the ones that are 18. You know, trying to tighten up that interval, perhaps even running them into the parlor 3 or 4 times a day instead of 1 to 2 times a day will help. Nutrition sometimes can play a role in colostrum quality. Looking at, have your veterinarian look at your vaccination program may help a little bit. But then, you know, making sure that my staff knows there is a little bit of variation in quality. When I'm having very good quality colostrum, making sure that's going into heifers. If I have to feed some marginal quality colostrum, that may be second feeding, that may be bull calf colostrum. Make sure also that you have some colostrum storage. We're going into short day length time of the year where colostrum production is going to drop. So I still go to dairies that they feed only fresh or refrigerated colostrum. They don't have anything frozen. This time of year, that becomes really dangerous. You really got to make sure that you have some sense of colostrum storage and a plan for what to do if I run out.
All right, awesome, thanks. We have one more question before we move on. Does feeding second colostrum transition milk have an effect on total serum protein?
Sure, it sure can. So, you know, I don't know that every dairy necessarily needs to give a second feeding, but there's a lot of dairies that do benefit from it. If you're consistently, your total proteins are 5.8, 5.7, it may be that the best thing for you to do is add a second 2-quart feeding. So typically, if we're giving 3 to 4 quarts initially, you may want to give a half a dose. So just 2 quarts roughly about 6 hours later. And again, the efficiency of the gut to absorb that isn't what it was at birth, but the calf will still absorb some of that. That may be the difference between getting you from 5.8 to 6.2. So there's certainly herds that benefit from a second feeding of colostrum, in my opinion. All right, was it the last question? I'm keep going here. I'm getting behind on time. So vaccination, I don't want to tell you what your vaccination program should be. That's a conversation between you and your veterinarian. Certainly, I think vaccination is part of the disease prevention program for your dairy. I think proper vaccination programs can help reduce both the risk of diarrhea and respiratory disease. I want to talk a little bit about kind of fundamentals, but I'm not going to tell you use these vaccines at these points in time. That's, again, a discussion between you and your veterinarian. But we already had one question about vaccinating or using oral products to reduce scours. To me, I think both from the science, if I look at the literature, and experience tells me the best way to help utilize vaccines to reduce the risk of calf scours is to vaccinate the cow. There are a lot of studies, they're older studies, they're from the 70s, but there's a lot of science behind what we call dry cow vaccination. Vaccinating the cow, letting the cow respond to those rotavirus and coronavirus antigens. That cow will then put those antibodies into her colostrum. The calf will absorb it into the gut and ultimately into the blood, where it's going to circulate for probably a couple of weeks. When that calf then gets challenged with rotavirus, say at day 7, day 8, those antibodies can be pumped from the blood back across into the gut. Okay, so this kind of shows what I was just talking about. Those antibodies get absorbed, they're in the small intestine. Ultimately, they get absorbed in the blood, and then they can get resecreted back across these mucosal surfaces. When we're using some of the oral antibody pastes that are out there, they're not producing blood levels that are near as high. I don't think these, there's a lot of research that I think needs to happen with some of these products, but I don't think they're going to ultimately be as effective as actually vaccinating the dry cow. I think that's probably your gold standard. I know some people like the convenience of not having to vaccinate cows. Maybe they like that some of the products have a color in it that turns the manure color, and they know their guys are doing it. But I think if you want maximum efficacy, probably the way to vaccinate to help with scours or minimizing scours is by vaccinating the cow. So just a couple of studies out there. This is, again, a lot of the original research on dry cow vaccination principles is old. Wanted to show you just a couple newer studies. This is a study from New Zealand. I was actually the senior author on this is a gentleman named Julanda Almali. He was a PhD student at Massey University in New Zealand. I was fortunate enough to be part of his PhD examination. He spent 2 years doing risk factors across 97 dairy farms. So these would be Holstein dairies, but pasture-based dairies in New Zealand. He looked at not only what's causing diarrhea, but what are the risk factors associated with farms. And in this study, one of the things that he found that had the highest ability to prevent diarrhea was using these dry cow vaccines. That was the second biggest risk factors that prevented diarrhea in his PhD. This is another study. This is from the country of Estonia. I show this just because it's fairly recent, but this was a study where they identified 6 large dairies that had a lot of problem with scours. They implemented dry cow vaccine, and then 4 out of those 6 farms showed a significant decrease both in the number of calves with scours as well as the severity of diarrhea. So obviously using dry cow vaccine is a little different than a regular vaccine. With a regular vaccine, we put it in the cow, we put it in the calf, we assume they respond, and we're not going to get disease. With dry cow vaccination, there's kind of 2 steps. Not only do we have to get it done properly in the cow, but we also have to make sure we have a good colostrum management program in place. Because if these calves are failure of passive transfer, they didn't really get those antibodies that were in the colostrum. The vaccine, even though I did it right to the cow, it may not help the calf. So this is probably our best way to go to consistently help reduce the risk of diarrhea. It's not magic. It's not going to make diarrhea go away, but it's part of everything else we've talked about already. I do think it's very, very helpful. So how do we use these? Again, there are a couple different products on the market, but typically heifers need 2 doses about 3 weeks apart, with the second dose given about a month before calving. And then cows just need a single annual revaccination, typically at dry off. So respiratory disease, obviously I don't want to go into great detail here, but I do think vaccination is really important. We're going to use vaccines typically pretty early, probably at birth, and most of the time those are intranasals. We know advantages of intranasals is they work much faster than an injectable vaccine that may take 10 to 14 days really to induce immunity. Intranasal vaccines also work much better in stressed animals, giving you some local immunity. So, typically most farms are going to use some type of intranasal vaccine against BRSV, against the IBR, which is our 2 main viruses, pretty soon, certainly within the first 72 hours after that calf is born. Again, very, very rapid onset of immunity, doesn't stress these calves like a systemically administered vaccine would. I've had this graph kind of in my data set for teaching students for a long time, just to kind of illustrate why these intranasal vaccines are really helpful. And you see this green line kind of response to a vaccine. It's really, really quick with intranasals versus the yellow line would be a killed vaccine where typically we need 2 shots to get much of an immune response. The red line is a modified live vaccine where, immunity goes up slowly over that 10 to 14 day period. So the advantage of this intranasal is it's quick, it's just not very long lasting. So if you are using an intranasal, make sure that before we move those calves out of hutches, out of barns at 8 to 10 weeks and into groups, we're either giving another intranasal or potentially using a systemically administered vaccine, depending on what your veterinarian recommends. But again, our goals of vaccination, certainly we want to protect that calf against any pathogens that are likely to cause diarrhea, that are likely to cause respiratory disease. But we also need to think about making sure this calf is ready for entry into the lactating herd, okay? What are core vaccines? To me, I make the analogy that this is like insurance. These are vaccines. I think these are health insurance. These are car insurance. I hope I never need to use them, but these are probably mandatory. These are non-negotiable. I think we all need to be using some type of modified live BVD, IBR, BRSV vaccine. We need to be making sure we're preventing lepto, and a lot of times the lepto vaccine may be in with the BVD, IBR vaccine, and then a clostridial vaccine. Those are things that I would consider absolutely mandatory for your herd. If you're not using this, again, I would talk with my veterinarian and say, you know, should I be doing this? Where would I put this in? But again, realize that by the time we get to 5 to 6 months, when we're using some of these BVD, we're using some of these IBR vaccines, I'm not as worried about that 8-month-old calf getting respiratory disease. It's still a possibility, but at this point, these vaccines are really becoming reproductive vaccines. I'm transitioning to preparing that calf for entry into the lactating herd. So we're really working on not so much preventing respiratory disease, but making sure that calf or that fetus is not going to get IBR, making sure it's not going to get exposed to BVD. So ultimately, to do that, we're probably going to vaccinate with these vaccines that we talked about. These are core vaccines, so modified live viral BVD IBR vaccine, probably with lepto and a clostridial vaccine, somewhere around 4 to 5 months. We're going to booster that about a month later, and then we're going to do it again before breeding, so at about 12 months of age. And to me, if you said, which is the most important of these, it's that 12-month. And a lot of people miss this or forget this or don't consider this important, but really this is your most important vaccine, not for preventing respiratory disease in that heifer, but for making sure her calf doesn't get exposed to any of these viruses. These are reproductive vaccines at this point, okay? So that pre-breeding dose will make sure that her immune level or immunity is really, really high during the time where that fetus is developing. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through a little bit of this, but these are other vaccines you could consider using. To me, this is like flood insurance. You know, if you live in Kansas, you probably don't need flood insurance. If you live in Eastern North Carolina, like I do, you probably do need flood insurance. Mycoplasma bovis, we've had great success with Protivity in some herds that struggle with it. That doesn't mean it's necessarily appropriate for everybody. Some herds have a Salmonella Dublin problem and have been able to incorporate vaccine to help. Mannheimia, sometimes we put Mannheimia vaccines in. They can be harsh sometimes, but in some herds we can time them properly where calves don't go off milk, and they can be helpful. All of these are things that could be used, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them core recommendations, okay? Other things we think about from prevention, again, these could be webinars in themselves, you know, housing, group sizes, cleanliness of milk and water, making sure we're doing a good job with sanitation, minimizing stress, making sure ventilation is good, air quality. We know there's a lot of studies that have tied ammonia levels and air quality to respiratory disease. We could spend 25 to 30 minutes on that, but those are all things that you want to think about along with prevention of disease, okay? And then lastly, just briefly here, early detection. We need to make sure we're recognizing disease early. There are different scoring systems in place. Most of you are at least somewhat familiar with these, where you can go through a couple times a week and have your employees, you know, look for nasal discharge, look at the eyes. Is there ocular discharge? Are the ears droopy? And do they need to be treated? You know, typically these calves will respond to treatment much better if we're catch these cases early, okay? Here's a video. These are calves on this dairy that just got identified today as respiratory disease, okay? To me, this is too late. These calves should have been picked up multiple days ago. This calf has his neck extended, it's breathing very hard. If that's the point where we're catching pneumonia, it's going to be too late. So we need to make sure we're identifying cases pretty early, okay? Certainly, thoracic ultrasound is out there. Some herds are using it, some herds are not. But we need to make sure we have some system in place to make sure our employees are able to identify both respiratory disease as well as diarrhea. Have treatment protocols in place. Work with your veterinarian to create these, at least for your common diseases. I really don't like the idea of protocols just being a pallet of products that we can tow a wagon full of antibiotics through the barn and the employees can choose kind of what they want. I think we need to have protocols be very clear. There's a first line of therapy, whether that's an oral electrolyte or an antibiotic or whatever. There's a second choice and then a third choice. No deviations, you follow the protocols. And what that will allow is consultants, veterinarians, even you, to really look at the data over time and say, is this protocol working? You know, if we're doing something sometimes when we have time to get it done, but we're not doing it at other times, that really creates difficulties in being able to assess how things are going. So have a treatment protocol in place, make sure your employees understand it, and make sure they know how to follow it. Scours, keys to treatment, again, make sure we're catching it early, aggressively use oral electrolytes, and then have some kind of IV fluid therapy protocol in place, because there's certainly calves that will eventually need IV fluids. This is a picture I always show veterinarians and say, you know, would you rather treat the calf on the left or the calf on the right? And most people always say the calf on the left. If the first sign of diarrhea is that calf didn't drink its milk today, we're too late, okay? We need to look at how aggressively these calves are drinking milk. Do they have sunken eyes? You know, other things than just the presence of scours to make sure we're catching these cases pretty early. Pneumonia, we talked about catching cases early, following the protocol of antibiotic established by your veterinarian. Make sure you're monitoring these calves pretty closely, and then monitoring treatment success. Every, you know, twice a year, sit down and say, is my protocol working or not? Keep records. The only way we can follow these protocols is by keeping records. At a minimum, make sure you're recording pneumonia. Make sure you're recording scours, probably pink eye, maybe bloats. If you're able to get individual total proteins, put those in your dairy comp, Bovasync, PC Dart, whatever you're using. Put body weights or average daily gains in there, okay? Help us as consultants be able to help you decide this is working or this is not working. Last couple slides, I would say, you know, we can't put too much emphasis on your employees. They are a critical part of the calf operation. You know, I've been to dairies where the manager would just show up and yell at everybody once a week. That's not very creative. That's not very helpful. We need to make sure we have managers that are there on a regular basis working with them, that they understand not only what they're supposed to do, but why they're supposed to do it. Make sure your employees are continual learners. Sometimes we need to train and then observe, monitor what they're doing. Sometimes we need to retrain. Sometimes we may even need to reassign. Not everybody's probably cut out to work with calves. You have to have a lot of patience, but make sure that they're continual learners, making sure you reward good behavior, celebrate what they're doing well, not just point out what's not going well. So things to think about as we close. You know, am I keeping records on disease? Can I go and tell the vet what % of calves are scouring in the first 3 weeks of life? Am I keeping track of treatments? Do I know what my death loss is? If I don't, you know, I can certainly, there's opportunity for improvement in keeping the proper records. I go to a lot of dairies where we do a very good job of keeping records on the cows, but not a very good job keeping records on the calves, or the calf records are in a notebook somewhere, but not in the computer. Do I ever check total proteins? If somebody asks me, what are my total proteins running right now, would I have any response? So if you're not, you know, ask your vet, should we be checking proteins when you come to palpate, you know, once a month or however often that is? What are my birth to weaning average daily gains? Do I have any idea what that number is? If I don't, you probably should. Do I know what weight my heifers are calving in at without the calf? Am I reaching 85% of mature body weight? Are there enough heifers in my pipeline to support current cull rates or current replacement needs? You know, have I sat down in the last couple of years and looked at my vaccination protocol with my veterinarian? Is it the same protocol I've been using for 20 years? Sometimes we need to update these things. Do I have written treatment protocols in place? If not, probably I should. So these are kind of things that I would like everybody to take from this and at least think about. If there's parts of these things that I'm not doing now, think about how can I get them implemented. So just to conclude, you know, I hope we can continue to transition to viewing calves not just as an expense, but really an investment in the future of the farm. we know a lot about, it's not just about survival, but quality. If we deal with disease, if we deal with heifers that just aren't grown well, they're never going to milk 35,000 pounds when they get in the herd. It's really the quality of that animal, not only her genomics, but her upbringing, that's going to really dictate how well she functions in your herd. So prioritize newborn care, nutrition, prevention of disease should be a priority. And with that, I will stop, and hopefully there's still some time for questions. I'm 5 minutes over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Yeah, we had a few questions come in, if you don't mind. We had the first one here is recently transitioned from acidified milk fed 1 time a day to pasteurized milk fed 1 time a day. Curious if there are studies on 1 time per day feeding. 7.6 liters are fed at the daily feeding. Most calves slam that right when fed.
So there are studies, they're older studies. So that was something that used to be promoted as a way to save labor. I will say I have been around dairies that do it and seem to manage it. It's certainly a risk. We know that when we feed larger meal sizes, it's going to slow abomasal emptying. You're also, so you may run a greater risk of bloat because of that. It's also, you know, if you are colder climates, as they digest that milk and they go for a long period without milk, they may struggle with low body temperature more than if we feed twice a day. I think, you know, I'm trying to get most of my herds to think about 3 times a day versus twice a day. I think once a day is certainly a risk factor for disease. If you feel like you're feeding 2 gallons once a day and you're managing things, I wouldn't insist that you change. If you said, you know, I'm struggling with health, I'm struggling with other things, do you think this could be a risk? I would say absolutely. And I would encourage you to think about feeding more frequently.
All right, and we have another question here for you. Besides scours, vaccines, which ones may improve colostrum?
I think probably all vaccines contribute somewhat. There are, you know, things like BVD. BVD antibodies will stay in that calf from colostrum probably longer than anything. Clostridial vaccines, the protection against Clostridium the first couple months of life usually comes from colostral antibodies. Most of those things, you may not always see an improvement in Brix readings, but a lot of those antibodies in there are used by the calf to help, you know, really prevent disease early in life. So it's not necessarily something that you can always detect when you look at a Brix reading or a quality, but most of the vaccines that we talked about is core. So BVD, IBR, BRSV, clostridial antibodies, all of those are really important to those calf in terms of early prevention of disease.
All right, and we have one left here for you, Dr. Smith. What do you think about vaccinating the cows at dry off with maternal respiratory vaccine and the consequent colostrum administration to protect calves against these diseases?
So if you're using a good modified live vaccine early in lactation, again, typically what we're doing is we're giving modified live vaccine somewhere in that 30 to 45 days fresh before we would get to breeding. Kind of the purpose of that is to make sure that calf has maximum immunity to, or the cow has maximum immunity to, let's say, BVD or IBR in that first 4 to 5 months of gestation, which is when bad things really happen associated with exposure to those viruses. So if you're doing that, those vaccines last a long time. I certainly don't think you need to come back at dry off with another vaccine or a killed vaccine. If you're not using a modified live vaccine early in the course of lactation, certainly something at dry off would be good. But typically when I build vaccination programs, I put them on a modified live early, and then I probably don't have a follow-up vaccine later on. Some people used to say, well, you know, these are 12-month vaccines. If I had a 15-month lactation, I would rather give something later just to make sure the colostral antibody is good. But certainly as an example with Bovishield, we've shown that vaccine really is effective for 16 to 17 months, and we still see very good antibodies that far in advance. So if you're using something like that in the cow every lactation, I don't know that you also need to use something to dry off.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. And that's the end of our questions. And thank you all for your participation. It's been a great webinar. And just to let you all know, if you want to watch a recording of this or if you want to share it, it will become available at www.hordes.com in our 2025 webinar archive. And
Thanks,
so
Sam.
thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Smith, for your time. And take care. Thanks, everyone.